One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, Jesus with his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" You know they used that finger. And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Oh, look, another argument between Jesus and the Pharisees. Shocker. More than that, another passage that our tradition and our history of interpretation sets us up to read as Jesus schooling the ignorant, the hidebound, the rigid. Another passage we've been trained to see in black and white, right and wrong. If it were that simple, that would be the end of the sermon, and you all know me better than that. This particular passage comes on the heels of, as I just noted, a lot of rapid fire work on Jesus' part. Mark's gospel reads with absolute urgency. One bare bones story with minimal description smack up against the next in an almost breathless litany of Jesus' early ministry. His authority gets established quickly through radical teachings backed up by physical healings that pull together huge crowds and garner a lot of attention. And what seems to get the authorities on edge is the claim to a divinity that has never before come from human flesh. Now, we're going to pause right there just for a second before we come down too hard on the Pharisees. Remind us, first off, Jesus kind of was one, not for nothing. So, he's not arguing with the bad guys, right? Like, he's arguing with his colleagues in so many ways. And before we come down too hard on them for being all up in their feels about this particular claim, please let us think just for a second about how we ourselves would react if someone were to make those same claims within our midst, right? Like, I can do this because I am the Son of Man. Like, even if there were apparently miraculous healings that accompanied them, wouldn't we be just a little bit like, right? We know the story, right? We know about Jesus. They didn't. This is the beginning. This has only been happening for a few weeks, right? And what's more, let's remember that the Pharisees actually did know what they were talking about most of the time. These were the folks, yeah, Bill, we have 20/20 hindsight. Totally and completely true. And so judging people who didn't have that, that's please not. As Leslie said, the Pharisees did know what they were talking about a lot of the time. These were the people who had grounded themselves in Torah, in the law. These were the ones who spent their lives arguing interpretation, who picked at the semantics of any given word, and who taught the people, to read and to discern and to question and to study. And they did all of this because they had been exiled. The temple had been destroyed, and all that they had left were these stories. All that they had left were their holy scriptures that had to be taught. These were people who had been oppressed, and this teaching, this leaning into scripture, had been the way that they maintained their culture and their identity in a foreign land. Even in Babylon, because of this teaching, they remained the people of God, the people who learned and kept the law, the people who kept the Sabbath when everyone else was working. And I'm gonna pause 10 seconds here to answer your question, Kaylee. Yes, they absolutely did teach the people to question. Questioning and pulling at interpretations and arguing about interpretations is actually what that whole gang was all about. That is rabbinic thought. That is where we get the volumes upon volumes upon volumes of interpretive documents that go beyond Torah. We get the Mishnah and the Talmud out of rabbis arguing with each other and their students arguing with them. It was absolutely encouraged because that was how you understood. It's just that the people who were writing these Gospels were frustrated that the Pharisees didn't understand the way that they did. And that lens gets broadcast down to us. So please understand, we are already reading a biased reading of these stories right from the get-go, right? Because the fracture within Judaism has already happened by the time a lot of this is getting written down. And they are maddest at the people who should have been able to understand, right? That also makes sense. This is human nature. With all of that said, and with that knowledge brought to bear on the whole of this text, it is hard to be fully mad at the Pharisees when they are horrified at Jesus' apparent disregard for this practice of Sabbath that had kept them knowing who they were and whose they were, both in the Babylonian exile and now under Roman occupation, where it feels like that exile could happen again at any moment. And more than that, in this moment, in what they say, they are not fully wrong. And honestly, even though we read this as a push-pull argument, Jesus isn't fully disagreeing with them in his responses. What Jesus says is not news to the Pharisees. This is mostly stuff other than the whole like the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That had them in their feels. The rest of it is a lot of stuff that they themselves would have said, but he is twisting it just a fraction, just enough to make them really, really uncomfortable. Because we really need to say in this moment that at no point anywhere in any interpretation of the Sabbath commandment has anyone ever argued that keeping the commandments, any of them, but this one most of all, that keeping Sabbath is more important than maintaining life. No one has ever said that, and probably no one will, although, who really knows? The Sabbath is not a fast from food, and it does not preempt immediate medical attention. Both of those are totally allowed on the Sabbath. It is not a moment in which one should be allowed to starve. It is not a moment in which someone is going to bleed out. So these arguments between Jesus and the Pharisees are about the nuances of meaning in the face of identity formation and anxiety and trauma. They're about maintaining a sense of unity in the face of an occupying force, in the face of a world that pulls at us very much in the same way that our own cultural understandings of behavior pull at us when we learn what's okay and what's not. And they help us to maintain maintain a cohesive whole, help us to maintain our own cultures in a diverse world, and to know who we are as a result. And it absolutely makes sense in all of this context that it is this particular commandment among all of the other commandments, that it would be Sabbath that would be the flashpoint, the spark that would ignite an absolutely disproportionate anger among the leadership. And here again, this is talking about the sense of understanding where they're coming from, not necessarily justifying their position, because, I mean, in the end, they want to destroy him. Not cool with that. A few weeks ago, beginning of March, mid-Lent, I preached on the 10 Commandments. And we acknowledge then that the commandment to Sabbath is the hinge in the middle of all of the other commandments. That is the one that bridges the gap. It is the movement from how we understand God on one side to how we treat each other as a result of how we understand God. And that hinge between the two is therefore a staple of identity formation over and against oppressive regimes that litter the history of the people. Because in Egypt, under Pharaoh, right before this commandment was given, the slaves were nothing more than cogs in this huge wheel of production. Most of you have heard me say this, I'm going to say it again anyway. To the point where the life of a slave was valued only for its productivity, its ability to work longer, harder, faster, for the sake of systems that did not love them and that did not give life. In a word of rest, in one commandment in the midst of so many others, we hear more clearly than possibly anywhere else about a liberating God who speaks of the value of humankind apart from our labor. In this word of rest, we hear reflected our own inherent value just for existing. God is telling us that we have value without having to prove it to anyone, without having to show receipts. And when we can recognize that, we can acknowledge that all of creation must therefore be equally beloved, equally valuable, equally in need of rest and relaxation. Which makes Sabbath not just the hinge, but the fulcrum, balancing love of God and love of neighbor, either of which could empty us entirely, but giving us a place to fill ourselves in the process. It is the balance point on which the whole system, the set of commandments that sets these people apart, rests. And from a culture, and from this, a culture is developed in which the realities of belovedness and liberation and equity are built directly into the rhythms of labor and rest for all people. All of which is absolutely excellent in theory and is a little bit hard to put into practice, and the rest of the world around us doesn't necessarily see it that way. And so, in the course of human development, Sabbath stops being a theoretical notion that enhances our understanding of ourselves as beloved and becomes a good, a nice, neat little box that we're supposed to check right in and of itself. This is what happens when Sabbath is taken out of the context of relationship with the selfless and community-focused loves to which the other commandments call us, the ones that have us pouring out from ourselves but never taking back in. When Sabbath stops being a hinge, a fulcrum, guiding and balancing the rest of the system, we already know what happens. What happens, indeed, when a law given for the whole of a people, for the sake of creating a culture of justice and equity based on the belovedness of all of creation, the equity and the love of all of creation. What happens when that becomes a means by which individuals are judged on their momentary behavior? Becomes the reason that people remain hungry or continue to struggle and suffer. When the social norms become the reason that we deny ourselves, that we mask or attempt to pass or contort ourselves against the cultural voices that tell us that we are not enough. Oh, maybe it's not just them. Yeah, it's never just a historical story, is it? The same group that is now criticizing Jesus and his disciples for plucking grain and eating are those who recently criticized them for eating with the wrong people, specifically for accepting a dinner invitation from a tax collector. How dare he? And while Jesus' retort that the Sabbath is made for humanity and not humanity for the Sabbath was already a commonly held interpretation that the Pharisees knew well and likely agreed with, the coupling of the commandment to Sabbath with the injunction to love one's neighbor, which includes feeding them, becomes in this moment a pointed rebuke. Where, after all, is the dinner invitation to the disciples, rather than the judgment for feeding themselves? Where is the creative impulse, rather than the destructive one? Where is the creation of community, rather than the maintaining of individual identity? Why keep Sabbath, after all, if not to live into the reality of universal belovedness, of a liberating God who does not make us earn our worth, but who is compassionate and nourishing and healing well before we even deserve it? Jesus' rebuke is not, as we might expect it to be, a full-throated condemnation of the Pharisees and of their insistence upon keeping this particular commandment. But it is an invitation to explore the ways in which we keep the commandments. It is an invitation to explore the meaning that we give to the identity formation we hold so dear. It is an invitation to acknowledge all that we bring to the act of interpretation of any given passage within our religious texts. And that actually includes the trauma that we bring and hold, and that forms part of us. Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisees is not one of hatred, but one of grief, that they have become so comfortable in static responses that these people who are called to question and to teach and to continue to learn have perhaps stopped grappling with the why behind their faith and the human realities that emerge as a response to it. Because in the commandment to Sabbath, we are not just invited to rest. We are invited into the reality of liberation from a culture that judges us by our productivity, our material gains or successes, our social status, and the ways that we keep the law. And the practice of that liberation, practice of the love that holds us and flows through us and fills us, should engage us in an identity that not only keeps the rhythms of rest, but that uses that rest, that mark of unconditional belovedness, as a hinge toward the belovedness of all people. The practice of keeping all of our religious principles and practices should engage us in compassion rather than in judgment. In a culture, a collective agreement that remembers that we are none of us free until we are all free. We are none of us fed until there are none who hunger. We are none of us whole until all are healed. We can none of us rest until all of us can live into the liberation that God desires for all. And still, that rest, even in the midst of the fight, is important. Could the man with the withered hand have waited a day to be healed on a day that wasn't the Sabbath? One assumes from the way the text presents him that this was not a life or death situation for which there are absolutely particular Sabbath exemptions. As I said, no one's going to bleed out on the Sabbath. That is not the way that works. But if we agree with Dr. King that justice deferred is justice denied, that liberation deferred is liberation denied, then what have we done with our Sabbath? What have we done with our Thanksgiving if it is not turned toward the creation of a reality in which all of creation can also give thanks for our wholeness in God? The Pharisees were not, in fact, wrong to see the Sabbath as a focus of identity in the face of oppression and exile. They were not wrong to create a culture in which the rhythms of Sabbath keeping had such tremendous importance that they needed to be taken very, very seriously, that they needed to be protected. Social norms are not themselves inherently bad, and nor are the practices that link us to our identity. Indeed, we are none of us wrong when we use the practices of our faith, our worship together, or our participation in the sacraments as building blocks of an identity built upon our intrinsic worth in the eyes of God. We are not wrong when we as individuals feel that worth seeping into the marrow of our bones. We are not wrong when we celebrate the various aspects of our identity, the parts of us that God lifts up and loves even when the world does not. We are not wrong to hold fast to the identity of beloved, as long as that identity remains the fulcrum on which we balance the belovedness we receive with the belovedness we see in all creation. We are not wrong until the rituals, the distinctions, the self-knowledge that forms us become barriers to the kingdom, become the point in and of themselves, rather than the means to compassion and grace and equity, flowing from God through us and out to all who share God's image. It would be naive for me to say that we necessarily do better than the Pharisees did. We, like the ancient Pharisees, often need the very same reminder, which is why we continue to come back to the Gospels time and time again. We need the reminder that our faith is not an end, but a means. We, like they, often understand the practices of faith as they apply to each of us individually, while setting aside the ways that we engage those practices to build community, to build a reality in which we respond to our belovedness by loving more deeply, in tangible acts of hospitality and healing. And we, like they, often need the reminder that while we as individuals might need a respite from the brokenness of the world, and that we are allowed to take that rest when we need it, the collective work of healing is one that continues until belovedness is not just our faith, but is the lived reality of all of creation. Thanks be to God. Amen.